Maria Santos pushed the mop bucket down the long hallway of the Navy Special Warfare Training Center, her rubber-soled shoes making soft, squeaking sounds against the polished concrete floor. At 5:30 in the morning, the building was mostly empty except for the occasional early riser heading to the gym or grabbing coffee from the break room. She preferred these quiet hours, when she could work without the constant chatter and testosterone-filled bravado that filled the halls during regular training hours. The cleaning cart rattled slightly as she navigated around a corner, passing framed photographs of distinguished naval officers and memorial plaques honoring fallen SEALs. Maria had memorized every face on that wall during her 6 months working here. She knew their stories, their missions, their sacrifices. The other janitors thought she was weird for reading the plaques so carefully, but Maria found something comforting in understanding the history of this place. She paused outside the main briefing room, checking her watch. The morning briefing wouldn't start for another hour, which gave her plenty of time to clean the space thoroughly. Maria pulled out her key card and swiped it, hearing the familiar beep as the lock disengaged. The room smelled like stale coffee and the lingering scent of the whiteboard markers used during yesterday's tactical discussions. As she began arranging chairs and wiping down tables, Maria couldn't help but glance at the whiteboard. Someone had forgotten to erase a mission diagram showing building layouts, entry points, and tactical positions. Her eyes moved across the markings automatically, recognizing the standard symbols for different types of operations. The plan looked solid, though she noticed they'd marked the northwest corner as a secondary entry point when the building's structural layout would make the southwest corner more advantageous for a surprise approach. "You're here early today?" Maria spun around, her heart jumping slightly. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison stood in the doorway, holding a steaming cup of coffee and wearing his standard-issue PT gear. His dark hair was still damp from what looked like an early morning run, and his intense blue eyes seemed to take in everything at once. Morrison was one of the senior SEAL instructors, known for his no-nonsense approach and extremely high standards. "Good morning, sir," Maria replied, returning to her cleaning. "I like to get the briefing rooms done before the meetings start." Morrison nodded and moved into the room, settling into one of the chairs she'd just arranged. He sipped his coffee while scrolling through something on his tablet, occasionally glancing up at the whiteboard. Maria continued her work, trying to ignore his presence, but something about the way he kept looking at the tactical diagram made her uneasy. "What do you think of this?" Morrison asked suddenly, gesturing toward the board. Maria paused, unsure if he was talking to her. When she looked up, his eyes were definitely focused on her face, not his tablet. "Sir?" "The mission layout. You were studying it pretty carefully when I walked in." Heat rose in Maria's cheeks. "I was just cleaning, sir. Not really looking at anything specific." Morrison stood up and walked over to the whiteboard, tapping the northwest entry point with his finger. "This building here, if you had to get inside without being detected, where would you go?" This was definitely a test of some kind, though Maria couldn't figure out what Morrison was trying to prove. She glanced toward the door, wondering if she should just excuse herself and finish cleaning later. "I wouldn't know anything about that kind of thing, sir. I just clean the rooms." "Humor me." Morrison's voice carried that tone of command that made it clear this wasn't really a request. "Pretend you're playing a video game. Where would you enter?" Maria looked at the diagram again, her mind automatically analyzing the tactical situation despite her better judgment. The building was a 2-story structure with multiple access points, surrounded by open ground on 3 sides and backed up against a wooded area. The team had marked entry points at the main door, a side window, and the northwest corner where a service entrance provided cover. "The southwest corner," she heard herself saying. "That service entrance on the northwest side looks good, but there's no cover once you're inside. The southwest corner has that utility room that connects to the main hallway, and there's a blind spot in the security camera coverage based on the angles marked here." Morrison raised an eyebrow. Security cameras aren't marked on this diagram. Maria's stomach dropped. She'd extrapolated the camera positions based on standard security layouts for this type of building, something that came naturally after years of studying such things. But Morrison was right. That information wasn't written on the board. I just assumed, she stammered. Assumed based on what? Before Maria could answer, voices echoed in the hallway outside. The morning briefing team was arriving early. Morrison glanced toward the door, then back at Maria. "We'll continue this conversation later," he said quietly. "Don't go anywhere when your shift ends." The next hour passed in a blur. Maria finished cleaning the briefing room and moved on to the locker areas, but her mind kept replaying the conversation with Morrison. She'd revealed too much, shown knowledge she wasn't supposed to have. The smart thing would be to call in sick for the rest of the week and hope Morrison forgot about their interaction. But Maria knew that wasn't realistic. Whatever test she'd stumbled into, she was going to have to see it through. By the time her shift ended at 3 o'clock, Maria had worked herself into a state of nervous exhaustion. She changed out of her work clothes in the employee break room, trading her uniform for jeans and a simple sweater. As she gathered her things, she kept telling herself that Morrison had probably forgotten about their conversation entirely. He was busy training the next generation of Navy SEALs. Why would he waste time thinking about a janitor who'd made a lucky guess about building security? But when she walked out to the parking lot, Morrison was leaning against her beat-up Honda Civic, still in his PT gear, but with a Navy windbreaker thrown over his shoulders. "Miss Santos." He pushed off from her car and approached her. "Ready for that conversation?" "Sir, I really don't think—" Maria Santos, age 28, employed here for 6 months. Morrison's voice was matter-of-fact, like he was reading from a file. Previous employment history shows mostly civilian jobs, restaurant work, retail, some office temp assignments, high school graduate, no military service listed on your background check. Maria's mouth went dry. "That's correct, sir." "So where did you learn tactical building assessment?" "I didn't learn it anywhere. I just made a guess." Morrison studied her face for a long moment. "You know, I've been training SEALs for 12 years. I can usually tell when someone's lying to me." They stared at each other across the parking lot, neither speaking. Maria felt like prey being evaluated by a predator, though Morrison's expression wasn't hostile, just intensely curious. "There's a training exercise tomorrow night," Morrison said finally. "Live fire simulation in an urban environment. We're short one opposition force member." "I don't understand." "I need someone to play the bad guy. Hide in a building, set up defensive positions, try to avoid capture by a SEAL team." Maria shook her head immediately. "Sir, I'm not qualified for anything like that. I'm just a janitor." "Are you?" Morrison tilted his head slightly. Because that janitor knew exactly where security cameras would be positioned in a building she'd never seen before. That janitor identified tactical weaknesses in a mission plan designed by officers with 15 years of experience. "I got lucky. Prove it." The words hung in the air between them. Maria realized this was the moment she'd been dreading and anticipating for 6 months, ever since she'd taken this job and tried to build a normal, quiet life for herself. She'd known that eventually, someone would notice. Someone would ask questions she couldn't answer without revealing things she'd worked very hard to bury. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Morrison smiled, and for the first time since she'd met him, the expression seemed genuinely warm instead of purely professional. "Show me what you've got. Tomorrow night, 1800 hours. You'll have 2 hours to establish a defensive position in the training facility. Then my team will come looking for you." "And if I say no?" "Then you say no, and we forget this conversation ever happened." Morrison stepped back toward his own vehicle. "But something tells me you won't say no." He was right, though Maria didn't want to admit it. The prospect of a real challenge, of using skills she'd kept buried for 2 years, sent an electric thrill through her that she hadn't felt in a long time. "What happens if your team catches me?" Morrison paused with his hand on his truck door. "They won't." "How can you be so sure?" "Because if I'm right about you, you're not going to let that happen." That evening, Maria sat in her small apartment, staring at the business card Morrison had given her with details about tomorrow's exercise. Her living room was sparse and functional: a couch, a TV, a small bookshelf filled mostly with mystery novels and technical manuals she pretended to use for her night school engineering classes. Anyone looking around would see the home of a working-class woman trying to better herself through education. They wouldn't see the carefully hidden compartment behind the bookshelf where Maria kept items from her previous life, items she'd sworn she would never touch again. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she'd memorized but never called. Lieutenant Sarah Chen had been her handler during her last assignment, the person who'd helped her disappear when everything went wrong in Kandahar. Sarah had promised that Maria could call if she ever needed help. But she'd also made it clear that reaching out would mean giving up the new identity and peaceful life Maria had worked so hard to build. Maria stared at the number for a long time, then put her phone away without making the call. Instead, she walked to the bookshelf and triggered the hidden compartment. Inside were documents, photographs, and a small collection of items that represented 5 years of her life she'd tried very hard to forget. At the bottom of the compartment was a matte black case about the size of a hardcover book. Maria lifted the case carefully and set it on her coffee table. She hadn't opened it in 2 years, but her fingers remembered the combination automatically. Inside, nestled in custom foam padding, were the tools of her former trade. Not weapons. She'd disposed of those when she went civilian. But surveillance equipment, communication devices, and other specialized gear that would be very difficult to explain if anyone ever found them. She picked up a small device that looked like an ordinary pen but was actually a sophisticated scanning tool capable of detecting electronic signals, structural weaknesses, and several other things that would be very useful in tomorrow's exercise. Maria had told Morrison she was just a janitor. She'd told herself the same thing every morning for the past 6 months. But as she sat in her quiet apartment, surrounded by the tools and memories of her previous life, Maria had to admit that Morrison was right about one thing. She wasn't going to say no. The next evening, Maria arrived at the Naval Special Warfare Training Center exactly at 6 o'clock. She'd spent the day researching everything she could about the facility's training areas, using her building access to scout locations during her regular cleaning shift. The urban warfare training facility was a maze of interconnected buildings designed to simulate city environments, perfect for the kind of exercise Morrison had in mind. Morrison met her at the employee entrance, no longer wearing his standard PT gear. Instead, he was dressed in full tactical equipment, looking every inch the dangerous professional Maria remembered from her previous life, though she'd never worked with SEALs specifically. "You came," he said, sounding mildly surprised. "Did you think I wouldn't?" Morrison studied her face. "I wasn't sure. This isn't exactly a normal request to make of a civilian employee." "Maybe I'm not exactly a normal civilian employee." They looked at each other for a moment, and Maria could see Morrison processing her words, filing away another piece of information in whatever mental profile he was building. "Rules are simple," Morrison said finally. "You have 2 hours to establish yourself in the training facility. Set up whatever defensive positions you want, hide wherever you think is best. At 2000 hours, my team comes in looking for you." "How many team members?" 4, plus myself. Maria nodded. 5 against 1 wasn't great odds, but it wasn't impossible either. "What are they looking for? Just to spot me? Or actual capture?" "Physical apprehension. The exercise ends when you're in custody or when you successfully evade capture for 4 hours. "And if I evade capture?" Morrison smiled. Then we'll have a very different conversation about your background and qualifications. He handed her a small radio and a GPS beacon. Safety equipment. The radio connects you to base communication, and the beacon will let us track your general location if something goes wrong. Maria clipped both devices to her belt, though she had no intention of using either unless absolutely necessary. Any other equipment? What do you need? Nothing. I'm good. Morrison raised an eyebrow but didn't push the issue. He led her to the entrance of the training facility, a complex of interconnected buildings that had been designed to replicate urban combat environments. The structures ranged from two-story residential buildings to a four-story office complex, all connected by alleys, courtyards, and underground passages. Your time starts now, Morrison said, checking his watch. We'll be monitoring from the command center, but we won't intervene unless there's a safety issue. Maria nodded and stepped into the facility. The moment she crossed the threshold, she felt something shift inside her mind. The careful walls she'd built around her previous life began to crack, and instincts she'd worked hard to suppress started reasserting themselves. She moved through the facility methodically, her eyes automatically cataloging entry points, sight lines, and potential defensive positions. The buildings were well-constructed replicas, complete with functional electrical systems, plumbing, and realistic interior layouts. Someone had put serious thought into making this feel like a real urban environment. Maria climbed to the third floor of the office building and found a window facing the main entrance. From here, she could see most of the facility's central area while remaining hidden in the shadows. She settled into position and began planning her strategy. 2 hours wasn't much time, but it would have to be enough. Morrison's team would be well-trained and experienced, but they'd also be expecting to hunt a civilian janitor with no real tactical knowledge. They wouldn't be prepared for someone who understood how they thought and how they operated. Maria checked her watch. 1955. 5 minutes until the hunt began. For the first time in 2 years, she felt truly alive. Maria pressed her back against the concrete wall, listening to the sound of tactical boots moving through the building below her. It had been 43 minutes since Morrison's team entered the facility, and she'd been tracking their progress through a combination of sound, vibration, and the occasional glimpse of movement through windows. They were good. Better than she'd expected, actually. The team moved with the silent efficiency of professionals who'd worked together for years, communicating through hand signals and covering each other's movements with practiced precision. If she'd actually been just a janitor hiding from Navy SEALs, the exercise would have been over in the first 10 minutes. But Maria wasn't just a janitor, and as she crouched in the shadows of the third-floor office space, she was beginning to remember exactly what she'd been before. The tactical radio on her belt crackled softly. Base to all units, time check. 45 minutes elapsed. Morrison's voice came through clearly. Hunter 1, continuing sweep of residential sector, no contact. Hunter 2, administrative building clear on floors 1 and 2, moving to 3. Maria's pulse quickened. Hunter 2 was directly below her, probably on the stairs right now. She'd chosen this position carefully. The office building's third floor offered excellent sight lines and multiple escape routes, but it also meant she was somewhat trapped if they cornered her here. She moved away from her observation window and deeper into the maze of cubicles that filled the floor. The space was designed to replicate a typical office environment, complete with desks, filing cabinets, and room dividers that created dozens of small hiding places. But Maria knew that trying to hide among the furniture was an amateur mistake. Professional hunters would clear this space systematically, and she'd eventually run out of places to conceal herself. Instead, she headed for the service corridor that ran along the building's east side. During her reconnaissance, she'd noticed that the corridor connected to a maintenance shaft that would take her down to the building's basement level. And from there, she could access the underground tunnels that connected several of the facility's structures. The sound of boots on the stairwell, was getting closer. Maria reached the service corridor and carefully opened the door marked Authorized Personnel Only. The maintenance shaft was exactly where the building plans had indicated, though it was smaller than she'd hoped. She'd have to crawl through about 20 feet of ductwork to reach the basement access point. As she lowered herself into the shaft, Maria heard the door to the main office area open. Hunter 2 had reached the 3rd floor. The ductwork was dusty and cramped, but Maria moved through it as quietly as possible. Her knees and elbows scraped against the metal sides despite her efforts, and she knew that anyone listening carefully would be able to track her movement. But the alternative was staying put and getting captured, which wasn't going to happen. She reached the basement access panel just as she heard footsteps directly above her in the service corridor. Hunter 2 had found the shaft entrance. Maria dropped into the basement and immediately moved away from the access point. The basement level was a maze of mechanical rooms, storage areas, and utility tunnels, perfect for someone who wanted to disappear. She'd studied the layout carefully during her preparation time, and she knew exactly where she was going. The tunnel entrance was hidden behind a false wall in what looked like a janitor's closet. Maria had discovered it by accident during her regular cleaning duties when she'd noticed that the wall didn't match the building's structural plans. A little investigation had revealed a maintenance tunnel that had probably been used during construction but wasn't marked on any of the current facility maps. As she slipped through the hidden entrance, Maria's radio crackled again. Hunter 2 to base. Found evidence of movement in the administrative building maintenance shaft. Target has probably relocated to basement level. Morrison's voice responded immediately. Copy that. Hunter 3, move to your assigned basement position. Hunter 4, cover the tunnel exits on the north side. Maria smiled grimly as she moved through the narrow tunnel. Morrison's team was adapting quickly to her tactics, but they were still thinking like hunters pursuing prey. They hadn't yet realized that they might be dealing with someone who could turn the tables on them. The tunnel system was more extensive than she'd originally thought. It connected not just the office building to the residential structures, but also ran under the facility's central courtyard and provided access to the 4-story tower that dominated the training area's skyline. Maria had initially planned to use the tunnels just for movement and concealment, but now she was beginning to see more ambitious possibilities. She emerged from the tunnel system in the basement of the residential building, moving carefully through a storage room filled with training equipment. The building above her was supposedly clear. Hunter 1 had swept through it 30 minutes ago, but Maria knew better than to assume the team wouldn't double back to areas they'd already searched. Instead of going upstairs, she made her way to another tunnel entrance that would take her toward the central tower. If she could reach the tower's roof level, she'd have a commanding view of the entire facility and could track the SEAL team's movements much more effectively. The tunnel leading to the tower was longer and more challenging than the others. Maria had to crawl through sections that were barely wide enough for her shoulders, and the air was stale and humid. But 20 minutes of careful movement brought her to another basement access point, this one inside the tower's foundation level. The tower was the crown jewel of the training facility. 4 stories of realistic urban combat scenarios, including apartment layouts, office spaces, and even a rooftop scenario designed to simulate hostage rescue situations. Maria had cleaned these floors dozens of times, but tonight she was seeing them from an entirely different perspective. She made her way up the service stairwell, pausing at each floor to listen for signs of the SEAL team. The building seemed empty, but Maria's instincts told her that Morrison wouldn't leave the tower completely unguarded. He was too good a tactician to ignore the facility's most valuable strategic position. On the 3rd floor, she got her answer. Through a crack in the stairwell door, she could see Hunter 4 positioned at a window facing the main courtyard, watching the approaches to the tower. He was well concealed and had excellent sight lines, but he was also focused outward, not expecting a threat to come from inside the building. Maria studied the situation carefully. She could try to slip past Hunter 4 and continue to the roof, but if he spotted her, she'd be trapped in the stairwell with nowhere to go. Alternatively, she could abandon the tower entirely and try to find another defensive position, but she was running out of time and options. Or she could do something that Morrison's team definitely wouldn't expect from a civilian janitor. Maria opened her small toolkit and selected a device that looked like an ordinary pen. She'd modified it years ago to serve as both a signal detector and a low-power electromagnetic pulse generator. It wouldn't damage any equipment permanently, but it would create enough interference to disrupt communications for several minutes. She activated the device and aimed it toward Hunter 4's position. There was a brief, barely audible hum, and then she saw the SEAL reach for his radio with a frustrated expression. "Hunter 4 to base. I'm getting some kind of interference on the comms. Signal's breaking up." Morrison's voice came through with heavy static. "Copy that! Technical difficulties. Maintain position." In the confusion that followed, Maria slipped past Hunter 4 and continued up to the roof level. The rooftop access door was locked, but Maria had brought more than just electronic gadgets in her toolkit. 30 seconds with a small tension wrench and pick, and she was standing on the tower's roof under the clear night sky. From 4 stories up, Maria could see the entire training facility spread out below her. The various buildings were lit by strategically placed floodlights that created pools of illumination connected by areas of deep shadow. She could track the movement of Morrison's team as they adjusted their search pattern, responding to Hunter 4's communications problems and the new evidence that their target was more capable than they'd originally assumed. Maria settled into a position behind the rooftop air conditioning unit and pulled out a small pair of binoculars she'd borrowed from the facility's equipment room. Now she could watch the hunters while they hunted her and start planning her next move. The radio chatter was getting more interesting as the SEALs realized they were dealing with someone who understood their tactics. "Base to all hunters, be advised that target appears to have technical capabilities beyond initial assessment. Maintain communications discipline and assume electronic surveillance." Hunter 2's voice came through with barely concealed frustration. "Whoever this is, she's not some random civilian. The movement patterns in that maintenance shaft were textbook evasion tactics." "Copy that," Morrison responded. "All units switch to backup communications protocol. We're dealing with someone with professional training." Maria smiled at that. Morrison was finally starting to figure out what he'd gotten himself into. She spent the next hour observing the SEAL team's search patterns and gradually developing a more complete picture of their capabilities and limitations. Hunter 1 was the team's tracker. He moved methodically and rarely missed evidence of her passage. Hunter 2 was aggressive and fast, but sometimes let his enthusiasm override his caution. Hunter 3 was the technical specialist, probably responsible for any electronic countermeasures they might deploy. Hunter 4 was steady and reliable, the kind of operator you wanted covering your back in a difficult situation. And Morrison himself was moving through the facility like a chess master, coordinating his team's efforts while simultaneously trying to anticipate Maria's strategy. He was very good, but he was still thinking of this as a hunting exercise rather than a tactical engagement. It was time to change that dynamic. Maria made her way back down from the roof, moving carefully to avoid Hunter 4's position. The SEAL was still dealing with intermittent communications problems, which gave her some additional cover. She reached the basement level and returned to the tunnel system, but instead of using it to escape, she began moving toward a position that would let her turn the tables on her pursuers. The facility's central courtyard was a key tactical location that all of the hunters had to cross periodically as they moved between buildings. Maria had noticed that they were using a specific route that kept them in cover most of the time, but there was one section, maybe 20 feet of open ground near the fountain, where they were exposed for several seconds. She positioned herself in a storm drain that ran under the courtyard's northeast corner. It wasn't comfortable, but it gave her an excellent view of the fountain area while keeping her completely hidden. More importantly, it was a position that none of Morrison's team would think to check, because it would be nearly impossible for a normal person to access without the right equipment and knowledge. Maria settled in to wait. According to the exercise timeline, she only needed to avoid capture for another hour and 40 minutes. But she wasn't planning to just run out the clock anymore. 20 minutes later, Hunter 2 crossed the courtyard exactly as Maria had predicted. She tracked his movement through her binoculars, confirming her analysis of the team's tactical patterns. 15 minutes after that, Hunter 3 made the same crossing, moving with professional competence but following the same basic route. When Morrison himself appeared at the courtyard's edge, Maria made her decision. She activated a small laser pointer, another piece of equipment that looked innocent but had been modified for tactical use. The red dot appeared on Morrison's chest for just a moment before she clicked it off and changed position. Morrison froze immediately, his training recognizing the implied threat even in an exercise context. His voice came through the radio with sharp authority. "All units, hold positions. Target has just demonstrated overwatch capability on my position." Hunter 1 responded first. "Say again, base?" "Someone just painted me with a laser from an elevated position. This is no longer a simple tracking exercise." Maria could hear the shift in tone as Morrison's team realized what had just happened. They'd been thinking like hunters pursuing prey, but now they understood they were engaged with someone who could threaten them just as easily as they could threaten her. "All units converge on my position for tactical assessment," Morrison continued. "We need to reevaluate our approach." As the SEAL team regrouped around Morrison's position, Maria used the opportunity to relocate again. But instead of moving away from them, she moved closer. The storm drain system connected to several other access points around the courtyard, and she was able to position herself within listening distance of their conference. Morrison's voice was calm but serious as he addressed his team. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are not dealing with a civilian contractor. Our target has demonstrated electronic warfare capabilities, advanced evasion tactics, and now Overwatch skills that suggest professional military training." Hunter 2 spoke up. "Sir, how do we proceed?" "We proceed very carefully. From this point forward, assume we're dealing with a hostile with advanced training and unknown capabilities. Full tactical protocol." Maria listened as Morrison reorganized his team's approach, shifting from a hunting formation to a combat patrol configuration. They were taking her seriously now, which made the exercise much more challenging, but also much more interesting. As the SEALs moved out in their new formation, Maria made her way back through the tunnel system toward her final position. She'd been saving her best card for the end of the exercise, and now seemed like the right time to play it. The facility's command center was located in a separate building connected to the main complex by an enclosed walkway. During her months of cleaning duty, Maria had noticed that the command center had its own independent power supply and communication systems, probably to ensure that training exercises could continue even if the main facility experienced technical problems. What the designers hadn't anticipated was someone who understood both the electronic systems and the physical layout well enough to exploit the connection between them. Maria accessed the command center through a maintenance tunnel that emerged in the building's mechanical room. From there, she could reach the primary electrical panel that controlled the facility's lighting systems. She checked her watch. 23 minutes remaining in the exercise. Time for the finale. Maria connected a small device to the electrical panel, another piece of equipment from her previous life that had been designed for exactly this kind of situation. With a few keystrokes on the device's miniature keyboard, she gained control of the facility's lighting grid. The lights went out across the entire training complex, plunging Morrison and his team into complete darkness. Emergency lighting kicked in after a few seconds, but the red-tinted illumination created a completely different tactical environment. Maria could hear radio chatter as the SEAL team adapted to the new conditions, but she was already moving toward her final position. The exercise had been scheduled to end with either her capture or successful evasion. But Maria had decided to give Morrison a third option, one that would demonstrate exactly what kind of person he'd been dealing with all along. She made her way back to the central courtyard, moving carefully through the emergency lighting to a position behind the fountain. Morrison and his team were regrouping near the administrative building, their night vision equipment giving them a significant advantage in the reduced lighting conditions. But Maria had spent years operating in environments where advanced equipment wasn't available, and she knew how to use darkness as a weapon rather than just an obstacle. She activated her radio for the first time since the exercise had begun. "Base, this is target. I'm ready to surrender." Morrison's voice came back immediately. "Target, maintain your position and await our approach." "Negative, Base. I'd prefer to do this on my own terms." Maria stepped out from behind the fountain, standing in the open courtyard with her hands visible but not raised. Emergency lighting cast long shadows across the pavement, and she knew that Morrison's team could see her clearly through their night vision equipment. Morrison emerged from the building with his four-man team, approaching her position with weapons lowered but ready. Even in the dim light, Maria could see the professional competence in their movement, the way they automatically positioned themselves to cover all possible escape routes. When they were about 10 feet away, Morrison raised his hand and his team stopped. "Ms. Santos," he said formally. "Or should I say, whoever you really are?" "Maria Santos is my real name," she replied. "Everything else is complicated." Morrison studied her face in the red emergency lighting. "I think it's time we had that conversation about your background and qualifications." Maria nodded. "I think you're right." As Morrison's team secured the area and began shutting down the exercise equipment, Maria realized that her 6 months of quiet civilian life were officially over. Whatever came next, there was no going back to just being a janitor who swept the barracks and tried to stay invisible. Morrison had wanted her to prove what she could do. Mission accomplished. The debriefing room was small and windowless, containing nothing but a metal table, 2 chairs, and a recording device that Morrison had deliberately left turned off. Maria sat across from him, still wearing the dark clothes she'd chosen for the exercise, while Morrison reviewed a thick file that definitely hadn't existed when she'd started working at the facility 6 months ago. "Staff Sergeant Maria Elena Santos," Morrison read from the file. "United States Army, Military Intelligence, 5 years active duty, specialized in reconnaissance and electronic warfare, multiple deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq, honorable discharge 2 years ago." Maria said nothing, watching Morrison's face as he continued reading. "Commendations for valor in combat, expert marksman qualification, advanced training in infiltration and surveillance." Morrison looked up from the file. "Should I keep going? How did you get that information so quickly?" Morrison tapped the folder. "I made some calls after our little exercise ended. Turns out that when you apply for a civilian job requiring security clearance, even as a janitor, certain people keep track of where you end up working." "People like who?" "People who were very interested to learn that one of their former assets was working at a Navy special warfare facility under an assumed work history." Maria's stomach clenched. She'd known this moment might come eventually, but she'd hoped to have more time to build her civilian life before anyone started asking questions about her past. "It's not an assumed work history," she said carefully. "I really did work at those restaurants and retail stores. I just didn't mention the 5 years before that." Morrison leaned back in his chair. "Why not?" "Because I wanted a normal job with normal people who didn't know what I used to do." "And what exactly did you used to do, Sergeant Santos?" Maria stared at the table for a long moment, deciding how much truth she was willing to share. The smart thing would be to stick to her cover story and hope Morrison's curiosity didn't dig any deeper. But after tonight's demonstration, she doubted that was going to be possible. "I was a forward reconnaissance specialist," she said finally. "My job was to get into places where we weren't supposed to be and gather information that couldn't be obtained through conventional means." "Spy work." "Intelligence gathering," Maria corrected. "Sometimes in hostile territory, sometimes in supposedly friendly areas where we needed to verify what our allies were telling us." Morrison nodded. "The electronic warfare training explains your little trick with Hunter 4's radio. That was just basic signal jamming, nothing sophisticated. And the building assessment skills, the tactical analysis of our mission diagram?" Maria met his eyes. "When you spend 3 years sneaking into buildings where people are trying to kill you, you get pretty good at reading architectural layouts and security systems." Morrison was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Finally, he asked the question Maria had been dreading. "What happened 2 years ago? Why did you leave the army?" This was the part of the story that Maria had never told anyone. Not the army counselors, not the civilian therapists, not even Sarah Chen, who'd helped her disappear into normal life after everything fell apart. "There was an operation in Kandahar," she began slowly. "Intelligence had identified a Taliban safe house where they were supposedly holding 2 American contractors who'd been kidnapped from a convoy 3 weeks earlier." Morrison waited patiently as Maria gathered her thoughts. "I went in alone to confirm the location and assess the security situation before the rescue team moved in. The intelligence was good. The building was exactly where they said it would be. The guard patterns matched what we'd been told. Everything looked legitimate. But when I got inside, there were no American hostages. Just a Taliban commander meeting with 2 men in civilian clothes who were definitely not kidnapping victims." Maria's voice became tight. "One of them was carrying identification that showed he worked for the same contractor company as the supposed hostages." Morrison's expression darkened as he began to understand what Maria was describing. "The whole thing was a setup," Maria continued. "The kidnapping story was false. Our supposed allies were using American intelligence assets to arrange a meeting with Taliban leadership, and they were using my reconnaissance mission to confirm that the meeting could take place without interference." Jesus. I had about 30 seconds to decide what to do. I could abort the mission and report what I'd seen, but that would mean losing the opportunity to gather intelligence on whatever deal was being negotiated. Or I could stay and try to document the meeting, but if I was discovered, there would be no backup and no extraction plan. Morrison leaned forward. "What did you do?" "I stayed. I recorded 3 hours of conversations between the contractor representatives and the Taliban commander. Financial transactions, weapons transfers, information about American troop movements that had been sold to the enemy." Maria's hands clenched into fists on the table. "Everything I needed to prove that people we trusted were getting American soldiers killed for money. And then everything went sideways. One of the guards spotted evidence that someone had been in the building. They started a systematic search while I was still inside, trying to get out with the recordings." Maria paused, remembering the terror of being hunted through a hostile building while carrying evidence that could destroy careers and possibly save lives. "I made it out, but just barely. The rescue team was already moving in because they thought I'd been compromised. When they hit the building, the Taliban commander was killed in the firefight, and the contractor representatives claimed they'd been held hostage the whole time." Morrison was quiet for a long moment. "What happened to your evidence?" "I turned it over to my commanding officer. He passed it up the chain of command with a recommendation for immediate investigation." Maria's voice became bitter. 2 weeks later, I was informed that the recordings had been reviewed and found to contain no evidence of wrongdoing. The contractor representatives had been debriefed and cleared of any suspicion. They covered it up. They buried it so deep that it never existed, and they made it very clear to me that pursuing the matter further would be detrimental to my health and career prospects. Morrison sat back in his chair, processing the implications of what Maria had told him. "So you left the army." "I left the army, and Sarah Chen helped me build a new identity with a boring civilian work history. I've been trying to live a normal life ever since." Maria looked directly at Morrison. "Until you decided to test the janitor's tactical knowledge." "I'm sorry," Morrison said, and Maria could tell he meant it. "I didn't realize I was putting you at risk." "You weren't supposed to know there was any risk to put me at." They sat in silence for several minutes, both considering the implications of the evening's revelations. Finally, Morrison spoke up. "The people who were interested to learn about your location, are they going to be a problem?" "I don't know. Probably depends on whether you're planning to make this conversation public." Morrison considered this. "What if I told you there might be another option?" "What kind of option?" Morrison opened another folder that had been sitting on the table. "Naval Special Warfare is always looking for qualified instructors, particularly people with real-world experience in reconnaissance and intelligence gathering." Maria stared at him. "You're offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a chance to use your skills for something positive instead of just hiding from your past." "Morrison, I can't—" "Jake," he corrected. "And hear me out before you say no." Maria crossed her arms but didn't interrupt. "You've spent the last 6 months trying to pretend you're someone you're not. Tonight proved that's not sustainable. You can't turn off skills like yours. They're part of who you are." "Those skills got me into trouble before." "Those skills weren't the problem," Jake replied firmly. "The problem was a corrupt system that didn't want to hear the truth. That's not what we're dealing with here." Maria wanted to argue, but something in Jake's tone made her listen instead. "The SEALs I train are going to be deployed in situations where their lives depend on understanding exactly the kind of tactics you used tonight. Electronic warfare, urban reconnaissance, adapting to unexpected threats." Jake leaned forward. "You could teach them things that might save their lives." "I'm not a teacher. You spent 3 hours tonight teaching 4 experienced SEALs that they had a lot to learn about tactical thinking. Seems like you're a pretty good teacher to me." Maria considered this. The idea of using her skills to help train the next generation of special operations personnel was appealing, but it also meant stepping back into a world she'd worked hard to leave behind. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Civilian contractor position," Jake said. "You'd work with our training teams to develop realistic scenarios and opposition tactics. Help us create exercises that actually challenge our people instead of just making them feel confident. And my background? The security clearance issues? Already handled. The people who were tracking your location were actually hoping we'd have this conversation. Turns out they have some use for someone with your particular combination of skills and experiences." Maria felt a chill run down her spine. "What kind of use?" Jake's expression became carefully neutral. "Nothing operational. But there are ongoing investigations into some of the situations you encountered during your Army service. People with knowledge of those events might be asked to provide consultation." "Consultation about what?" "About whether certain contractor relationships represent security risks that need to be addressed." Maria stared at Jake as the implications sank in. "You're saying someone actually wants to pursue what I found in Kandahar?" "I'm saying that times change. Political situations evolve, and sometimes evidence that was inconvenient 2 years ago becomes very relevant today." They looked at each other across the table, and Maria realized that this conversation had been planned long before Jake had challenged her to prove her skills. Someone had been watching her, waiting for the right moment to make contact and offer her a way back into the world she'd tried to leave. "How long have you known who I really was?" she asked. Jake smiled. "I suspected something after our first conversation about building tactics, but I didn't know for sure until tonight." "And the exercise?" "The exercise was real. I needed to confirm your capabilities before I could make the offer I was authorized to make." Maria felt manipulated and grateful at the same time. Jake had given her a chance to demonstrate her skills, but he'd also maneuvered her into a position where she couldn't easily refuse whatever came next. "What happens if I say no?" "Then you say no, and you go back to your civilian life." "But Maria?" Jake's voice became serious. "You can't go back to pretending you're just a janitor. Tonight change that, whether you take this job or not." Maria knew he was right. The walls she'd built around her previous life had cracked tonight, and there was no repairing them. She could try to find another civilian job in another city, but she'd always be looking over her shoulder, wondering when someone else would notice that the quiet employee had skills that didn't match her resume. "If I take this job," she said slowly, "what guarantees do I have that I won't end up in the same situation I was in before? What happens if I uncover something that people don't want uncovered?" Jake met her eyes. "You have my word that any intelligence you develop will be acted upon appropriately, regardless of who it implicates." "Your word." "My word. And the backing of people who are very interested in cleaning up some of the problems you encountered during your previous service." Maria considered this. It wasn't a perfect guarantee, but it was more than she'd had 2 years ago when she'd tried to report what she'd discovered in Kandahar. "When would I start?" Jake smiled. "Technically, you started tonight. That exercise was your job interview." "And did I pass?" "Maria, you turned a training hunt into a tactical demonstration, disabled our communications, took control of the facility's infrastructure, and then surrendered on your own terms." Jake's expression became admiring. "If that's not a passing grade, I don't know what is." Maria felt something she hadn't experienced in 2 years, a sense of purpose that went beyond just surviving from day to day. The prospect of using her skills to train people who would face the same kinds of dangers she'd encountered was appealing. More than that, the possibility of finally seeing some justice for what she'd discovered in Kandahar made the risk seem worthwhile. "I have conditions," she said. "Name them." "I want to know exactly who I'm working for and what they expect from me. No hidden agendas, no surprise missions." Jake nodded. "Agreed. I want regular contact with the people investigating the Kandahar situation. If I'm going to be a consultant, I want to know how my consultation is being used." "That can be arranged. And I want the right to walk away if this turns into something I can't support." Jake extended his hand across the table. "Deal." Maria shook his hand, feeling like she was stepping through a doorway into a completely different life. Again. "So," she said, "when do I meet my first class of students?" Jake grinned. "How about Monday morning?" "I've got a team of junior SEALs who think they're pretty smart about urban warfare tactics." "What makes you think they need additional training?" "Because until tonight, I thought I was pretty smart about urban warfare tactics, too." Jake gathered up the files from the table. "Something tells me these kids are going to learn a lot from their new instructor." As they left the debriefing room, Maria caught sight of herself in the reflection of the darkened windows. She looked the same as she had when her shift ended 6 hours ago, but everything else had changed completely. She wasn't Maria Santos the janitor anymore. She wasn't quite Maria Santos the Army intelligence specialist either. She was something new, someone who could use the skills from her previous life to build something better in her current one. For the first time in 2 years, Maria felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. 3 months later, Maria stood in front of a classroom full of Navy SEAL trainees, wearing civilian instructor clothing and feeling completely at home. The whiteboard behind her was covered with tactical diagrams and urban warfare scenarios, and the students were paying attention with the kind of intense focus that came from knowing their instructor had real-world experience in everything she was teaching them. "The key to successful reconnaissance," Maria was saying, "is understanding that your biggest advantage isn't your equipment or your training. It's the fact that your enemy doesn't expect you to be there. One of the students raised his hand. Ma'am, how do you maintain that advantage when you're operating in a hostile environment? Maria smiled. You become someone they don't see as a threat, someone invisible, unremarkable, forgettable. She gestured toward the tactical diagram on the board. Someone like a janitor sweeping the floors. The students laughed, and Maria felt the satisfaction that came from passing on hard-won knowledge to people who would use it to stay alive and protect others. After class, Jake appeared in the doorway of the classroom. How are they doing? He asked. They're good kids, Maria replied, erasing the whiteboard. Smart, motivated, willing to learn. And how are you doing? Maria paused in her erasing and considered the question. 3 months ago, she'd been trying to hide from her past and pretend she was someone she wasn't. Now she was using every skill she'd ever learned to prepare the next generation of special operations personnel for the challenges they'd face in the field. I'm doing exactly what I was meant to do, she said. Jake nodded. Any regrets about taking the job? Maria looked around the classroom, thinking about the students who would graduate in a few weeks and deploy to dangerous places around the world, carrying with them the knowledge she'd shared with them. None at all, she said. This is where I belong. Outside the window, another janitor was pushing a cart down the hallway, quietly cleaning the building while the important work of training America's elite warriors continued around him. Maria watched him for a moment and smiled, remembering when that had been her job. She'd been good at sweeping floors and staying invisible. But she was much better at this.